Last week, Pastor Dan began our sermon series entitled Together, What is the Church? And he spoke on what is a church member? What is a church member? What is the responsibility of being a member? And what is the real joy that exists in belonging with a local body? And he named, honestly, that we're moving together in a way where you all will carry an increasing amount of responsibility as far as it concerns the elders and membership of the church and the things that we believe. It can feel very new to us. So last week, again, what is a church member? This week, what is a pastor? We're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 5, and you can turn there. But before I go to 1 Peter 5, I just want to tell you something about the man who's about to preach it. The first time that somebody called me pastor was when I was 23 years old, and I did not feel at 23 very ready. I felt very small. The task felt very, very big. And as I look back on that young man now, I am just so thankful for the people of God who were around me at the time, for the patience that they had, and the loving patience that they had to love me more fully into the pastoral office. 5 years into being a pastor, I stepped aside from full-time vocational ministry. I wasn't burned out. I hadn't lost my way, but I stepped out because I wanted to be better shaped. I wanted my mind, my spirit, my mind and my spirit, my heart to be shaped for the longer road that I believed was ahead of me. I had accomplished 5 years, and I saw the long task of pastoring that remained, and so I went to seminary. I surrounded myself with mentors. I let the years have their effect, and then by grace, I came back to the work. I love pastoring. I love it. I love pastoring this church. But here's what those years taught me. The man standing here each week isn't really what this office is all about. The office is really about a different shepherd. And the man up here is really just another one of the sheep who's been given the privilege of walking out in front for a little while. And this is really the image that sits at the heart of what we're going to see in 1 Peter 5. In 1 Peter 5, Peter is writing to a group of churches in the area that we know today as Turkey, churches under real pressure. And he opens this closing section here by turning first to pastors and then to the church as a whole. In these 11 verses, I believe we'll see that he gives one of the richest portraits of pastoral ministry anywhere in Scripture. And so here's what I want you to see tonight. If there's nothing else that you hear as you walk out, this is what I want you to think and to remember. That a pastor is a fellow sheep who oversees and shepherds God's people under the chief shepherd, so that we can all eventually one day see his face together. Let's read 1 Peter 5. We'll start in verse 1. Peter writes, "So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that's about to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be dominion forever and ever. Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Peter begins his section here addressing elders. Before we follow him too much further, I want to answer a question that Peter's letter assumes that we already know the answer. How does a man become an elder in the first place? We have now begun including a notes section at the end of your bulletin. This would be a really good note to make. Make sure to go take a look at 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. I'm going to talk about it just here for a minute or two. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul lays out for Timothy, who is a pastor and a man that he has mentored, he lays out the qualifications for an elder. And I want to talk about just 3 things very briefly, okay? This is how you become a pastor. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul mentions the very first thing is something that we call the internal call. He begins, when he talks about what an elder is, he says, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. In becoming an elder or a pastor, the Spirit is drawing a man into this work. The second thing, if you go and you later read this passage in 1 Timothy 3, you'll notice that Paul is very concerned with character. With one exception, that he be able to teach everything that Paul is talking to Timothy about here is a description of the kind of man the pastor is, not actually the work that he performs. Character, and I guess the last thing here is also that there's an affirmation of that call. There's an internal call, there's character, and then there's an external call. And that's where the church comes in. The external call is a confirmation of God's people that yes, this man is already doing the work of a pastor, and we want to submit to him. We talked about voting a bit last week and confirming of elders. And I just want to assure you, friends, that we're never going to put a perfect man before you, because there isn't one. And we know, Dan and I do, because shockingly, we are not perfect men. But when we set a man before you, he must meet the profile described in 1 Timothy 3. And your role is not just to rubber stamp somebody who Dan and I were to put forward, but to actually make a judgment. Not judgment on a stranger, but a judgment on a brother who will have pastored in front of you, you have seen him work. It's to confirm what you already see, not in hope that he might do, but a confirmation of what he is already doing. I've joked with people before that my hope is that when we bring on new pastors at a church, when any church brings on new pastors, that there would be a response among the people of, oh, finally, I'm so glad we finally made this official. Because the external call isn't just a vote, it's a united desire to submit to a man as an elder. And so when Peter, going back to what he's writing here, when Peter addresses the church in 1 Peter 5, he's addressing men, first of all, who have already walked this path. And the first thing that we see there is how Peter addresses pastors and also addresses himself. Because when he addresses pastors, he first gives a preamble of who he is. And I want you to notice here how he frames himself. How Peter speaks about himself and other elders tells us something about what it means to be a pastor. For those of you who don't know, Peter is an apostle, okay? He's an apostle. He was one of the 12 who walked with Jesus. He was the one who Jesus said, "You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church." Peter is one of the heads of the church in Jerusalem, the mother church of this entire Christian movement. In the hierarchy of the early church, if we can even describe it that way, Peter would be near or at the top. He's writing to pastors scattered all throughout the area of Turkey, men that most of us haven't heard of, pastoring at churches in cities that many of us will never know. And so by any measure here, if we're ranking, Peter outranks all of them. And yet look what Peter calls himself here. He calls himself a fellow elder. In Greek, That's actually one word. It's a single word, and it seems like Peter may have invented it just for this use. It's one word that means fellow elder, co-elder. One of us is what this means. Because Peter would have had any right, every right, to pull rank. He would have been able to say, hey, I was there when Jesus rose from the dead. I was there at Pentecost. I was there when the Holy Spirit fell on the Gentiles, and it was me who gave the sermon right after. I'm here speaking with apostolic authority, and if I say it, I expect that you're going to do it. He could have said those things, and it would have been true. But instead, he says, in effect, I come to you on the basis of the same authority that you have in your own church, the authority of a man who's been called by God to shepherd his sheep. Notice what Peter mentions about himself, not his position. He marks himself as a witness of the sufferings of Christ and a partaker in the glory about to be revealed. What Peter shares with this man, what he shares with them and with us, is not a rank, it's a testimony. We share the same testimony that Peter has, that Christ has suffered, and the same hope that one day that will be revealed. Here's what this adds up to. Peter, who could have claimed rank, instead he chose a new word, fellow elder. Peter, who could have named his position, named his testimony and his hope. And it tells us something that was apparently true as early as the beginning, the early church with the disciples, that in the church of Jesus Christ, there is no such thing as a celebrity pastor. There's no such thing. There are pastors with larger platforms, larger crowds, larger readership, and nothing is wrong with that. It's not sinful for there to be a big church. Nothing wrong with that. But none of it adds up into a difference of authority. A famous pastor is not more of a pastor than a faithful pastor in a congregation in a church that we will never hear of. The authority of a pastor is not a ladder that some pastors climb to get to the top. It's a gift that all pastors hold equally. And this is the posture of the office that we see played out in the heart of Peter. The man who stands up here every Sunday is not above the sheep. The man who stands here is among the sheep. The man who stands up here is not on a higher rung, but shares the same testimony that Christ has suffered for us. Christ has suffered and Christ will be glorified. That's the only authority that a pastor has that's worth naming. Let's go to chapter 5, verse 2, because he gives these men that he is talking to two commands, and he names them as two commands, but he really means them as one. The first command that he gives is shepherd. Shepherd. Shepherding is the work of guidance and care and discipleship. It's sitting with a grieving family. It's walking a couple through premarital counseling. It's visiting the hospital. It's the patient, long relational work of helping people take the next step toward Jesus. That's shepherding. The second command is to oversee. Overseeing is the work of direction and leadership and teaching. It's standing in the pulpit here and opening the word. It's setting the direction for a church. It's making hard decisions about what the body should do and what it shouldn't do. It's preserving and transmitting the truth. That's overseeing. And you can see and feel the difference, right, between overseeing and shepherding. Shepherding is often quiet and slow. Overseeing is often public and decisive. Shepherding may happen in a hospital room. Overseeing may happen in an elders meeting. Shepherding is pastoral care. Overseeing is pastoral leadership. But Peter wants to make sure that we don't pull these two things apart. Notice what he does in this one verse. He says shepherd, and in the same breath he says overseer. Two different words for two different kinds of work. And then if we look back at verse 1, he calls those same men elders. So he's got seemingly three names for this work that he has here. But he's treating them as a single office. He's basically saying in effect, hey, overseers, make sure you shepherd. And hey, shepherds, make sure that you oversee. The work of leading a church, the work of caring for a church, or the work of leading a church is the work of caring for the church, and the work of caring for the church is leading the church. We as pastors don't get to pick one and skip the other. And this is really important for both Dan and I to consider, for you to consider, for any man that we might bring before you, or any men here who may aspire to the office of elder. More often than not, a man will have a certain affinity for one piece of pastoral ministry over and against the other. Some men come into the office because they love teaching. They love making hard decisions. They love the work of setting direction for God's people. Others come into the office because they love the intimate work of sitting with people in their pain, walking with them through seasons of suffering and joy. And that affinity, by the way, is not a problem. That's not a problem. That's just God making different men differently, okay? But what becomes a problem is if a pastor decides he's only going to do one, only going to do part of the job. If someone says, I want to help lead the church, but I don't want to sit with people, that man's probably not called to be an elder. If a man says, on the other hand, I love being with people, but don't ask me to teach, and I don't want to make a hard decision, that man is probably not called to be an elder. The office requires both. And so Peter fuses these together on purpose. Think of it this way. A shepherd in the ancient world did not just lead the sheep to the pasture, right? He actually tended to their wounds. He would carry a lamb over rocky ground. If one got lost, he would go and look for it. But that same shepherd who cared for the sheep was also the same one who would figure out which pasture he was going to take them to tomorrow. The care and the direction were not two different jobs in the field for two different men. They were one job held together by one shepherd for the sake of one flock. And that's the office that Peter's describing here. And that's really the heart posture toward the office that you all should look at for any man that we might set before you. Moving on to the last part of verse 2 and verse 3 here, we begin to see the heart of a pastor. What we've seen is Peter telling pastors what to do, shepherd and oversee. And then he takes it just a little bit deeper because as a pastor, you can do both of those things. You can lead well, you can care well, but you can still do it in the wrong way. Let me point out what I mean there. Peter is pointing out that he's moving from function to heart, from the outside of the office to the inside. And he gives us three contrasts that we're going to look at. Three, not this, but this. Not this, but this. And what those pairs are going to expose is the pastor's heart, what it must look like underneath the work. Listen to them again. I read them earlier. But the first one is not under compulsion, but willingly. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering, but being an example. There's three temptations that Peter says, and there's three corrections. The first one, the temptation is to compulsion. Compulsion, big word. It just means serving the flock because I have to, not because I want to. It's showing up in the pastoral task like an employee who just clocks in, maybe present in body but absent in heart. Peter's correction here is he urges pastors, shepherd willingly as God would have you. Not because your contract says that you have to, not because somebody pressured you into the office, not because you haven't figured out a way to get out of it, but willingly. That doesn't mean that every moment of pastoral life feels easy. There are draining conversations, aren't there, Dan? There's long weeks, week after week. There's seasons where the weight is heavier than we ever thought it would be. But that's not what Peter means by compulsion. Compulsion is a posture of the heart, not necessarily here's how I feel about it today, about how things are going right now. Because underneath those hard weeks, a willing shepherd is a settled man. I want to be here. I want to be where God has called me to this people. The second temptation is gain. When we hear shameful gain, our minds probably, like mine, first go to money. This would be a pastor who milks his congregation for his salary, a pastor who fundraises with guilt, a pastor for whom ministry is a paycheck. And that reading here is an accurate one, and it goes back all the way to the Old Testament. The prophet Ezekiel railed against the leaders and shepherds of Israel who were feeding themselves instead of feeding the sheep. They were eating the fat, they were wearing the wool, they were slaughtering the best of the flock for their own tables. The temptation here is to treat the flock as a resource to extract from. And Peter names it here. But I'll be honest with you personally just for a second. That obvious reading, pastoral greed for money, is not a temptation that I face at this moment, at this stage in ministry. I gladly serve you all without a salary. So the most obvious form of shameful gain isn't really one that I struggle with. But there's really a deeper reading to this, and it cuts a little bit closer for me, because there's more than one kind of gain that a pastor can seek from a flock. There's the gain of being respected, the gain of being seen as helpful, the gain of being seen as wise, the gain of being the one someone thinks of when they need pastoral care. None of those things are evil. Respect is good. Being helpful is good. Wisdom is a gift, but any one of them can quietly reshape the way or the reason that a pastor shows up. I'll be honest with you, I know this one because I can feel the pull at times. I know what it is to want to be the one that you think of when you need wisdom. I know what it is to want my help to be appreciated. Those things, though, that's not necessarily proof of a corrupt heart, but it is proof of a heart that needs watching. Pastors must watch their heart. Because the moment any of those things become the reason that I pastor, I've drifted from Peter's eagerly over into a version of shameful gain. I've started to take from the flock something that the flock was never there to provide for me. Peter's correction, though, is one word: eagerly. Not what can I get from these people, but I want to give myself for these people. It's a heart that is toward the flock, not a heart that is toward oneself. The third temptation is one that Peter reserves his sharpest language for. It's not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. There is a type of pastoral leadership that treats authority as leverage. And it sounds like this: my role gives me the right to control outcomes. My role gives me the right to apply pressure. My role allows me to get people to do what I want them to do. This is the pastor as a manager. This is the pastor as a boss. The pastor as like a CEO. This kind of a pastor moves people with weight instead of witness. And Peter says, though, that's not how leadership works in the church of Jesus Christ. Of course, though, pastors have authority. We've already seen that pastors do hold real authority, the authority of a man called by Christ to shepherd Christ's sheep, and that authority is real. Of course it's real. It's just not an authority of force. It's an authority of a life worth following. A pastor doesn't stand over his church and order them and say, go that way. Instead, he does, as Paul says in one of his letters, it says to the flock, follow me as I follow Christ. The most powerful thing that a pastor brings to a church is not strategy. It's not charisma. It's not even gifting. It's a life that is worth imitating. I want to say that again because I think it's really important. It's important for you to hear. It's important for me to say, because this is the one area of pastoral ministry that's the easiest to fake and the hardest to do. And that is, again, the best thing, the greatest thing that a pastor brings to a church is a life worth imitating. The pastor's own life is meant to be a visible picture of the message that he proclaims. So we pull those all together. What is a pastor? According to Peter here, he's not a reluctant shepherd, but a willing one. He's not a self-serving shepherd. He's an eager one. He's not a controlling shepherd, but one whose life can be followed. These three contrasts, again, show you what you should look for in a pastor. What you should look for if we set a man before you for consideration. They tell you what to pray for those who already serve you as pastors, because the most dangerous failures of pastoral ministry are not failures of function, they're failures of the heart. Always failures of the heart first. Go with me to verse 4. After giving these warnings, Peter gives us a sentence of hope. He says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." This one sentence kind of anchors everything we've seen so far. Peter calls Jesus by a specific title, the chief shepherd. And of course, this is no accident. Peter's been referring to elders as shepherds, as pastors as shepherds already for several verses. And so now he names the one who is over them, the one who outranks every shepherd, the one whose flock all shepherds help tend. You're a shepherd, Peter says, but Jesus is the chief shepherd. And that changes everything, because it changes things like the question of, why do I pastor? Why do I pastor? Because the answer is now, I pastor because Christ put me here. Not because I wanted the position, not because I'm gaining something from it, but the chief shepherd assigned a flock to me, and he told me to watch over it until he comes back. It changes the question as for a pastor as whose approval am I looking for? Because the approval that ultimately matters doesn't come from the flock. And it doesn't come from any pastor who might be next to me. It comes from the good shepherd himself at his appearing, and it takes the form of an unfading crown. Friends, this is actually a lifeline for pastors in pastoral ministry. What Peter warns about in his previous verses, compulsion, shameful gain, domineering, kind of collapses back into this question of whose gaze a pastor is living under. If the pastor is performing for the flock, he's going to tend toward compulsion or toward gain. If a pastor is shepherding or performing, if he's performing for himself, he's going to tend toward control. But if the pastor is shepherding under the gaze of the chief shepherd who sees him perfectly and loves him perfectly, and who's coming back for him, then he has a place to stand. Let me tell you honestly what I know about this. The thing that catches me when I sense myself drifting is not my own discipline, and it's usually not a verse that I memorize. It's the memory, or really the knowledge, that I'm going to stand before the chief shepherd one day and give an account for the sheep that he put in my care. That's not a threat, though. It's a mercy. It's a mercy because it means that I'm not drifting unnoticed and I'm not shepherding alone. Peter names three things on that day. The chief shepherd will appear, a crown will be given, and the crown is unfading. Earthly rewards fade. Respect fades. Recognition fades. The affection of a congregation can ebb and flow. Even the pastor's own sense that he's doing well fades. None of that is the reward a pastor is living for. Peter says the reward is an unfading crown placed on the head of a shepherd by the chief shepherd at his appearing. So I'll say this to Pastor Dan, who carries this office with me, to the men in this room who aspire to it, and to the pastor speaking these words, hear this. You shepherd at the pleasure of Jesus. You shepherd in his strength. You shepherd in seasons of lean and plenty. Not for the reward you can see, but for the reward that he will bring when he appears. That is what holds a pastor and his heart together. Go with me to verse 5. Peter makes a turn here. Everything that we've said so far has been about the office of pastor. And now he turns, he says, look at verse 5. He says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Peter's been addressing pastors, and now he's addressing the whole church. You can almost imagine like a large room with a whole bunch of churches in it and their pastors. He's been talking just to the pastors, now he's talking to everyone. But he doesn't say, okay, lay people, now here's your section, okay? No, he says all of you, pastors and everyone else, just like our sermon series title, Together, everyone together. This matters because it means the picture Peter is about to give is a picture with the pastor on the inside. What Peter's drawing here is not a list of rules for ordinary church members. It's a portrait of what a church looks like as it journeys together. Pastors among the flock, not above it. All walking in the same direction toward the chief shepherd. And that shapes our question. Here's a question. If what follows is what a journeying church looks like, how does a pastor shape a flock whose heart is turned this way? Before I go on, I want to pause for a moment though, okay? We're going to get back to 1 Peter, but I asked Pastor Dan a question this week. For all the men who have ever served Northtown Trinity as elders, what did each man uniquely emphasize in his ministry at NTC that shaped the life or worship of our church? Some of you know every man who has pastored here. Some of you know no other pastors at this church except for Dan and me. But all of these men have profoundly impacted our church's life. Here's what Dan wrote. Pastor Caleb brought warmth and an atmosphere that welcomed questions. Pastor Jeremiah brought sincerity and created a culture of practical and relational evangelism. Pastor Michael brought humility and modeled intentional missional living. Pastor Ben brings compassion and models sacrificial service for others. And for himself, Dan simply wrote, biceps tattoos. Seriously. But I will say of Dan, Pastor Dan brings genuine love and longing for the lost and a unique blend of commitment to both radical inclusion and the truth. If you have been at Northtown Trinity for a week or two, or any longer than that, you have been directly impacted by the ministry of all of these men, even if you've never met them. Peter names 3 characteristics to emphasize as a pastor, okay? Humility, anxiety cast on God, and steadfast resistance to the devil. Humility comes first, and we're going to sit there with that one the longest because it really has a lot to inform on the other 2 that really grow out of it. Go with me to verse 5 and 6. Peter's explicit about humility in 2 directions here. The first one is humility toward one another. He says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. I love the picture there. Humility is a garment that we put on. It's not a feeling that we wait to have. It's a chosen posture toward the person next to us. The second is humility before God. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. Peter lifts our eyes from the person who's next to us to the God who is above us, and he calls his hand mighty. Humility recognizes that God's hand is mighty and our hands are very small by comparison. And notice how Peter grounds this. He doesn't try to sell humility as a nice trait or a helpful social skill. He roots it in a proverb. He says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Those are really high stakes, aren't they? To be proud is to be opposed to God. To be humble is to be an object of his grace. So how does a pastor shape a humble church? First, he shapes it by teaching. He opens the word and names pride when he sees it without flinching. He calls humility what it is, submission to God, and he resists the temptation to make it softer or more palatable. A pastor also shapes a church of humility by example, because nothing forms a humble church like a humble shepherd. A pastor who stands over the church cannot shepherd a church toward humility, because his own posture is preaching. It's preaching a different message than the one that's coming from his lips. Humility is built under shepherds who are themselves humbled under the mighty hand of God, who receive correction, who admit error, who refuse to pretend the office makes them invincible. The second characteristic of the church that Peter describes here is a church that casts its anxieties on God. And you see, a church must first be humble in order to cast its anxieties on God. He says, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. And I just want to say this. How many anxieties are you supposed to cast on God? All of them. Not some of them. Not just the spiritual sounding ones that sound like it's good to mention. All of them. You are not meant to hold these things, manage these things, hide these things by yourself. A pastor shapes a church in that direction by being honest himself. A pastor should name heavy things from the pulpit so that the congregation knows that they're allowed to name them too. A pastor should make himself the kind of man that people trust to bring these hard things to, not because he's a savior, but because he's a fellow sheep and he's willing to point them to the one who truly cares. The third characteristic also grows out of humility. A church that has bent its neck under God's mighty hand is a church that can stand firm against the devil. Peter says, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him firm in your faith. Peter doesn't soften here, does he? The devil is real, not a metaphor, real. The devil is real, and his method is to isolate and pick people off one by one. The sheep who has wandered, the sheep who is alone, the sheep who is tired. Peter's command here is to resist, firm in your faith. Hear that, firm in your faith, not firm in your willpower. Okay? Not firm in your willpower. It's faith that holds its grounds because Christ holds it fast. The pastor's work here to create or to foster a church that resists the devil humbly is to stay awake himself. A pastor must be awake. He must go after those who drift and to keep reminding the flock of believers around and across this country and around this world who are weathering the same storm. A pastor, by the way, who sees a sheep wandering and does not go after it is not a shepherd. So a church that is journeying together here, to bring this section together, church journeying together is a church of humility. It's a church that casts its anxieties on God, a church that stands firm against the devil, and the pastor's work is to shape a flock whose heart is turned in that way. Here's the piece I want you to take home, though, on this. When Peter says, clothe yourselves, all of you, he's speaking to the whole church, and that includes the men who stand right up here. A pastor does not shepherd the church from outside the flock. He's one of the sheep who's been given the privilege, again, of walking out in front for a while. But he's walking with them under the same mighty hand of God, casting his own anxieties, resisting his own devils, and clothing himself with the same humility of Christ, heading in that same direction. And that's really what this whole together means in this series. That is what this church is. That's the kind of pastor that you should want. And by God's grace, that's the kind of pastor that I want to be. Verses 10 and 11. This is where we're headed. This is where we're headed. This is where what the pastor shepherds toward. This is where the church of humility and anxiety casting and steadfast faith is walking together under the mighty hand of God. Look what Peter promises. He says, after you have suffered a little while. He doesn't pretend that the journey is easy. He tells the truth. There is suffering, real suffering in this life. But notice the measuring word, a little while. Whatever this church that he's speaking to in Asia Minor, whatever they're going through and enduring, whatever this church in North Kansas City is enduring, Peter frames it as a little while. He doesn't do that, by the way, because the suffering is small. It's not because it's small. It isn't. It's because eternity is huge, and suffering is dwarfed by what's coming. Peter says here, the God of all grace who has called you to his eternal glory. Peter names God here, and the name he chooses is warm. That's very warm. The God of all grace. All grace. The one who has every kind of grace that we need. The grace for the one who has drifted, grace for the weary believer, grace for the one who's afraid. And that God has called us to his eternal glory. He's not called us to a manageable life. He's not called us to a slightly better life. Eternal glory with Christ. And he ends here with four verbs. He says, this God will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. But who does those? It's not you. It's not your discipline. It's not your pastor. He will do it. He will strengthen what is weak. He will confirm what is real. He will restore what has been broken. He will establish what the winds of the seasons has tried to shake. Friends, this is the end of the sermon, and this is the really end of everything. This is where the whole of pastoral ministry is pointing. This is why the pastor gets out of bed on Monday morning and tries again. This is why you keep coming back Sunday evening after Sunday evening, week after week, to open this word, because the God of all grace is going to finish what he started, and he's going to do it himself. And then Peter ends with a doxology. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. The right response to a promise of eternal glory isn't commentary, it's just worship. To him be the glory. And that's why each week we end the Nicene Creed with the words, we look forward to the resurrection of the dead and to life in the world to come. And each week when we come to this table, we read from 1 Corinthians and end our time together with the words, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes, because everything we do points forward. The pastor shepherds forward. The church walks forward. The sermon ends forward, because a pastor is a fellow sheep who oversees and shepherds God's people under the chief shepherd, so that together we arrive at the sight of his face. In front of us today, bread and a cup, the meal that the chief shepherd gave his flock, his body broken, his blood shed, his coming promised. Every week this supper does quietly what this sermon has been saying loudly. It says pastors and flock eat the same bread and they drink the same cup. It says that the heart of pastoral ministry is not what I produce, but what Christ has produced. It says that we're all headed somewhere, and that the shepherd that we walk behind is the same shepherd that sets the table.